6 months ago, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my son's kitchen at 7 in the morning, waiting for someone else to bring me my tea. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent 43 years as a librarian, helping others find what they needed, and now I can barely find my way to the bathroom without my glasses. The fall that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I was rushing to finish my grocery shopping before the senior discount ended. One moment I was reaching for a can of soup on the top shelf, the next I was sprawled on the cold linoleum floor of aisle 7, my hip screaming in protest. The young paramedic who helped me had kind eyes, but I could see the pity there too. "Don't worry, ma'am," he said, "these things happen. These things happen." As if my independence was just another item that could slip from my grasp and shatter. David drove 3 hours from the city the moment he got the call from the hospital. My son, my successful, caring engineer son, took one look at my x-rays and the walker the physical therapist insisted I'd need for months, and made the decision for me. "Mom, you're coming home with us. Jessica and I have plenty of room, and you shouldn't be alone while you recover." At the time, I was grateful. The alternative was a rehabilitation facility that smelled of disinfectant and defeat, where I'd watched my friend Helen disappear into herself before she passed last year. Jessica had been so sweet about it too, rearranging their spare bedroom to accommodate my things, buying a shower chair, even installing grab bars in their guest bathroom. "We're family," she'd said, squeezing my hand with her perfectly manicured fingers. "This is what family does." Those first weeks felt like a gift, despite the pain. David would help me down the stairs each morning, and Jessica would have my tea ready, Earl Grey with 1 sugar, just how I liked it. She'd set up my books on the kitchen table where the light was best, rotating between the large print mysteries I'd requested and the historical fiction that had always been my escape. I felt useful when she asked my opinion on color schemes for her real estate listings, or when David sought my advice about a difficult client. We were a family again, the way we'd been when David was young and would call me every Sunday without fail. I tried to contribute however I could. Despite the walker and my increasingly blurry vision, the macular degeneration had been worsening for 2 years. I insisted on folding laundry and setting the table for dinner. Jessica would laugh and call me stubborn, but in a fond way that reminded me of how I used to tease David when he'd refuse help with his homework. I'd prepare simple lunches while they were at work, leaving covered plates in the refrigerator with little notes: "David, your favorite tuna salad, extra pickles," or "Jessica, that chicken salad you mentioned liking." Evenings were the best part. David would come home, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, looking so much like his father had at that age that my heart would catch. We'd sit in the living room, him in his father's old recliner, me on the couch with my feet up as the doctor ordered, and talk about everything and nothing. He'd tell me about his projects, the bridge renovation that was giving him headaches, or the new junior engineer who reminded him of himself 20 years ago. I'd share stories from my library days, the regulars who'd become like family, the rare books that had passed through my hands like secrets waiting to be discovered. Jessica would usually join us after finishing her client calls, curling up next to David with a glass of wine and adding her own stories from the real estate world. She had a talent for voices, imitating difficult clients in ways that made us all laugh until my sides hurt. Those moments felt precious, 3 generations under one roof, sharing the day's small victories and defeats. I should have known it was too good to last. Nothing that perfect ever does, especially when it's built on someone else's sacrifice. But at the time, adjusting my reading glasses and sipping my perfectly prepared tea while listening to my son's laughter, I allowed myself to believe that maybe losing my independence had led me to something better. Maybe this was how families were supposed to work, taking care of each other when the world became too sharp and unpredictable. I was wrong, of course. But in those early days, wrapped in the warmth of what I thought was unconditional love, I couldn't see the storm gathering behind Jessica's careful smiles and David's well-meaning but absent attention. I was just a mother, grateful to be home. The changes started so small I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It began with Jessica's eyes, the way they'd linger on me just a moment too long when I asked for help reaching the coffee mugs from the higher shelf. Not the patient, understanding look from before, but something harder. Something that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't quite name. "Really, Margaret," she said one morning when I dropped my spoon for the third time, my arthritic fingers betraying me again. "Maybe you should focus more on holding things properly." Her voice carried that same tone I'd heard her use with difficult clients on the phone, professionally pleasant but with an edge sharp enough to cut. I laughed it off, the way I'd learned to do with all the small indignities of aging. "These old hands have a mind of their own," I said, bending awkwardly to retrieve the spoon. But Jessica had already turned away, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already spotless. The eye-rolling started after my first physical therapy appointment. I'd come home exhausted, my hip aching from the exercises, and mentioned to David how challenging the session had been. Jessica, sorting through mail at the kitchen counter, let out what I can only describe as a theatrical sigh. When I looked at her, she was staring at the ceiling with an expression I recognized from David's teenage years, pure, unfiltered exasperation. "Something wrong, dear?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Nothing at all," she replied, but her smile was as thin as paper. "I'm sure physical therapy is very demanding." The word demanding hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself wondering if I had been complaining too much. Maybe I was being overdramatic about the pain. After all, Jessica was young and healthy. What did she know about joints that felt like rusty hinges or muscles that refused to cooperate? I decided to keep my discomfort to myself after that. But the comments kept coming, each one so reasonable on the surface that questioning them made me feel petty. When I couldn't find my bookmark and asked if anyone had seen it, Jessica would say, "Maybe try harder to remember where you put things, Margaret. It helps to pay attention." When I mentioned that the new medication made me feel dizzy, she'd respond with, "You're being dramatic." Everyone adjusts to new medications differently. I started keeping a small notebook, nothing elaborate, just a little pad I'd found in David's desk drawer. At first, I told myself I was recording these incidents to discuss with my doctor, to see if the medications were affecting my memory or perception. But deep down, I was creating evidence, though for what, I couldn't say. Tuesday, March 15th, Jessica said I was exaggerating when I mentioned the pain in my hip was worse today. "Weather is rainy," doctor said that affects arthritis. Thursday, March 17th, asked Jessica to help me read the small print on the new eye drops bottle. She said, "You need to learn to be more independent, Margaret. I can't read everything for you." The worst part wasn't the comments themselves, it was how they made me question everything. Was I being too needy? Had I always been this helpless, and people were just too polite to mention it before? I'd spent decades helping patrons at the library, guiding them through research, solving their problems with patience and kindness. Now I couldn't even trust my own perception of a simple conversation. Jessica's stress at work became the convenient explanation for everything. Her real estate agency was having a difficult quarter, she was working longer hours, showing houses to increasingly demanding clients. David would mention this whenever I hesitantly brought up her behavior, his voice gentle but dismissive. "She's under a lot of pressure, Mom. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, not really. I'd never used stress as an excuse to be cruel to someone vulnerable. Even during my worst days at the library, dealing with budget cuts, difficult patrons, or personal struggles, I'd never taken it out on someone who depended on me for help. The isolation crept in gradually. Jessica stopped asking my opinion on her work projects. She'd take phone calls in another room, lowering her voice when I entered. When David shared news about his day, she'd respond with enthusiasm, but if I tried to add to the conversation, she'd suddenly remember urgent emails that needed answering. I found myself spending more time in my room, telling myself I was giving them space. But the truth was simpler and more painful, I was hiding. For the first time since moving in, I felt like an intruder in their home, an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed her welcome. The woman who'd once commanded respect in her professional life, who'd raised a successful son and maintained her independence well into her 70s, was disappearing. In her place was someone I barely recognized, uncertain, apologetic, constantly second-guessing herself. And the most frightening part? I was starting to believe Jessica might be right about me. By April, Jessica had stopped pretending to be kind. The first time she forgot to pick up my prescription eye drops, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. She'd been juggling 3 house showings that day, and the pharmacy was out of her way. "I'll get them tomorrow," she promised, but tomorrow came and went with a dozen excuses. My eyes burned constantly without the drops, making reading, my last refuge, nearly impossible. "Maybe you don't really need them," Jessica suggested when I mentioned the discomfort for the 3rd time. "You managed fine before you started using them, didn't you?" I stared at her, wondering if she'd forgotten that I'd only started the drop 6 months ago on my doctor's strict orders. The macular degeneration was progressive. Without treatment, my remaining vision would deteriorate faster. But the way she looked at me, with that mixture of impatience and barely concealed disgust, made me swallow my explanation. "I suppose I could try to manage," I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. The deliberate exclusions were harder to document but impossible to ignore. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room, Jessica and David sharing looks that felt like secret handshakes I'd never learned. When David's sister called to check on me, Jessica would answer and conduct the entire conversation herself. "Margaret's resting," she'd say, even when I was sitting right there, gesturing frantically to get the phone. I started timing my movements around their schedules, creeping down to the kitchen only after I heard David's car pull out of the driveway and Jessica's shower start running. I'd make my tea quietly, eat my toast standing at the counter, and retreat to my room before anyone noticed. It felt safer that way, though I couldn't have explained why. The worst part was dinner. What had once been our sacred family time became a minefield of subtle cruelties. Jessica would serve David first, then herself, leaving my plate for last, if she remembered it at all. She'd engage David in animated conversations about people I'd never met, places they'd been before I moved in, plans they were making for when things get back to normal. Normal. As if my presence had fundamentally disrupted the natural order of their lives. "Remember that little restaurant in Portland?" Jessica would say, her eyes bright with performance. "We should go back there for our anniversary. The one with the impossible stairs." David would laugh. "You made me carry you up 3 flights because you refused to take the elevator." They'd continue like this for minutes at a time while I sat there, invisible, pushing food around on my plate and wondering when I'd become furniture in their lives. When I tried to contribute, sharing a memory of a restaurant I'd loved, or asking about their anniversary plans, Jessica would respond with monosyllables or change the subject entirely. "Actually, David," she'd interrupt, "did you remember to call the contractor about the deck?" The message was clear: I had no place in their real conversations, their future plans, their inside jokes, or their shared memories. My attempts to discuss Jessica's behavior with David felt increasingly futile. She had a talent for timing her worst behavior for when he wasn't around, leaving me with nothing but my own perceptions to rely on. And those, I was learning, were apparently suspect. "I think Jessica might be upset with me about something," I ventured one evening when we had a rare moment alone. David looked genuinely surprised. "Upset? Mom, she's been nothing but patient with you. Maybe you're misreading the situation." Misreading. There was that word again, the one that made me question whether my 43 years of reading people, of understanding the subtle dynamics of human interaction, had suddenly abandoned me along with my hip mobility and clear vision. "She seems stressed," I tried again, choosing my words carefully. "She is stressed," David agreed readily. "Work has been brutal, and having the house full has been an adjustment for both of us. Maybe if you try to be a little more understanding of what she's going through." Understanding. As if I hadn't spent months tiptoeing around their schedules, minimizing my needs, apologizing for my very existence. As if I wasn't lying awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong, cataloging every interaction for signs of my own failures. That night, I added a new entry to my notebook. April 18th, David says I'm misreading Jessica's behavior. Says I should be more understanding. Beginning to wonder if I'm losing my mind. The handwriting looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the confident script that had once filled library cards and recommendation lists. Even my penmanship was betraying me, becoming as fragile and unreliable as everything else in my life. I closed the notebook and stared at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, diminished, apologetic. Where was the Margaret Chen who had commanded respect in professional meetings, who had raised a son with confidence and grace, who had navigated the world with dignity even as her body failed her? She was disappearing, erased bit by a woman who had never liked her and a son who refused to see what was happening right in front of him. The fall happened on a Thursday morning in early May, when the spring rain had made everything slippery and treacherous. I'd been trying to be more independent lately. Jessica's constant reminders about my neediness had finally sunk in, so I attempted to shower without asking for help. My glasses sat on the bathroom counter, fogged and useless from the steam. Without them, the world blurred into dangerous shapes and shadows. I'd finished washing my hair and was reaching for the towel bar when my foot slipped on the wet tile. The grab bar Jessica had installed months ago, back when she still pretended to care, caught my desperate grasp for exactly 1 second before my sweaty palm lost its grip. I hit the shower floor hard, my shoulder taking the brunt of the impact against the glass door. The sound was tremendous, like a gunshot in the small space, and I lay there for a moment, stunned and gasping, water still cascading down on me from above. "Mom!" David's voice, panicked and distant. I heard his feet pounding up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time the way he used to as a child, racing to show me a drawing or a good grade. He found me curled on the shower floor, naked and shivering, my shoulder screaming in protest every time I tried to move. Without hesitation, he stepped into the shower fully clothed, turning off the water and wrapping me in the towel I'd been reaching for. "It's okay, Mom. I've got you," he murmured, and for a moment I felt safe again, protected by the son who had once promised to always take care of me. That's when Jessica appeared in the doorway. She took in the scene, David kneeling beside me in his soaked business clothes, me trembling and probably looking every bit as pathetic as I felt, and her face transformed. Not with concern or compassion, but with something cold and calculating that made my blood freeze despite the warm towel around my shoulders. "Really, Margaret?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Again?" David looked up at her, confused. "Jessica," she fell. "We need to. She always cries for attention." The words exploded from her with such venom that I actually flinched. "She's fine, she just wants sympathy. Can't you see what she's doing?" The bathroom fell silent except for the drip of water from the shower head and my own ragged breathing. I stared at Jessica, unable to process what I'd just heard. In all my years of dealing with difficult people, cranky patrons, demanding administrators, even my own mother's sharp tongue, no one had ever spoken to me with such naked contempt. "Jessica," David said quietly, his voice carrying a warning I'd never heard before. "She's hurt." "Is she?" Jessica crossed her arms, her perfectly applied makeup unmarred by any trace of concern. "Or is this just another performance? Another way to make sure we're all focused on poor, fragile Margaret and her endless problems?" The words hit me like physical blows. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd been trying to be more independent, that this was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. But the shame was overwhelming, not shame for falling, but shame for being seen as manipulative, as someone who would fake an injury for attention. I didn't mean. I started, but my voice cracked and the words died in my throat. David helped me to my feet, his movements gentle despite the tension radiating from his body. "Let's get you dried off and check for injuries," he said, deliberately not looking at Jessica. But I was looking at her. I was memorizing the satisfied expression on her face, the way her lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. This wasn't anger or stress or a bad day at work. This was something else entirely, something that had been building for months behind her careful facade. "David," she continued, her voice now artificially reasonable, "you can't keep enabling this behavior. She needs professional help, not someone rushing to rescue her every time she has an episode." Episode. As if my genuine fall, my real pain, was nothing more than a psychological condition to be managed. David was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I felt something inside me break. Not my shoulder, though that throbbed with each heartbeat. Something deeper, more fundamental. The last remaining piece of trust I'd had in my own family. "Maybe," David said finally, and his voice was careful, diplomatic, "maybe you could try to be more positive about these situations, Mom. Accidents happen, but your attitude about recovery really does make a difference." My attitude. As if wanting comfort after a fall was a character flaw. As if needing help at 74 years old was a moral failing that required correction. I let David help me to my room, let him bring me ice for my shoulder and painkillers from the medicine cabinet. But I barely heard his gentle words of comfort, barely felt his worried touch as he checked for serious injuries. All I could hear was Jessica's voice, sharp and certain, "She always cries for attention." For the first time since moving into their home, I understood with crystal clarity that I was not family here. I was not even a welcome guest. I was a burden they tolerated, a problem they needed to solve, a source of inconvenience that Jessica was tired of pretending to care about. And my own son, my David, whom I'd raised to be kind and protective, had chosen his wife's narrative over his mother's reality. As I lay in bed that afternoon, my shoulder aching and my heart broken, I realized that the woman who had slipped in the shower was not the same woman who had climbed out. That woman had still harbored hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that love would eventually triumph over whatever darkness had taken root in Jessica's heart. This woman, the one staring at the ceiling while ice numbed her shoulder, knew better. This woman was beginning to understand that she was completely, utterly alone. The first time my glasses disappeared, I spent 2 hours searching every surface in my room, running my hands along the nightstand, the dresser, even under the bed where my arthritic knees screamed in protest. When Jessica found them on the kitchen counter later that afternoon, I felt nothing but relief and embarrassment. "Oh, they were just moved to clean the table," she said, her voice perfectly reasonable, almost apologetic. I should have mentioned it. I thanked her profusely, ashamed that I'd worked myself into such a panic over nothing. After all, housework required moving things around, it was logical that items would be displaced. The fact that I couldn't remember leaving them there was just another sign of my failing memory, another small defeat in the daily battle against my own deteriorating mind. But it kept happening. My glasses would vanish from my nightstand, only to appear hours later in the bathroom medicine cabinet. They'd disappear from the kitchen table and resurface on the living room mantel, a shelf I hadn't been able to reach since my fall. Each time, Jessica had a perfectly plausible explanation. She was dusting. She'd moved them to keep them safe. She'd found them in odd places and hadn't wanted to worry me about my forgetfulness. Without my glasses, the world became a dangerous blur of shapes and shadows. The hardwood floors transformed into treacherous landscapes where every shadow could hide an obstacle. The stairs became mountains I couldn't safely navigate. I started moving like a blind person, hands outstretched, shuffling my feet to avoid tripping over furniture that seemed to shift locations when I wasn't looking. And I fell. Again and again. A stumble in the hallway when I misjudged the distance to the wall. A collision with the coffee table that left my shin purple and swollen. A near disaster on the stairs that I avoided only by grabbing the banister so hard I pulled a muscle in my back. Each incident left me more shaken, more afraid to move through what had once been a safe space. Jessica documented everything with the dedication of a research scientist. She'd appear moments after each stumble, her phone in hand, taking photos of overturned lamps or knocked-over plants. "David needs to see how unstable you're becoming," she'd say, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "This can't continue, Margaret. Someone could get seriously hurt." The someone, I understood, wasn't me. It was them, the people who might be held liable if something happened to the elderly woman in their care. "Look at this," I heard her telling David one evening, their voices carrying up the stairs to my room. "She knocked over the plant stand again today. And yesterday she walked straight into the doorframe. I'm worried she might be having some kind of episodes." Episodes. That word again, clinical and dismissive, reducing my genuine struggles to symptoms of mental decline. "Her vision has been getting worse," David's voice, defensive but uncertain. "Maybe we should make another appointment with her eye doctor." "David, this isn't about her eyes anymore." Jessica's tone was patient, like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "This is about cognitive decline. She's becoming a danger to herself. And to us. What if she falls down the stairs? What if she leaves the stove on? We could lose everything." I pressed my ear to my bedroom door, straining to hear David's response. When it came, it was quiet, defeated. "What are you suggesting?" "There are facilities," Jessica said gently. "Nice places. Places where she'd get proper care from people trained to handle situations like this." Situations like this. As if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person who deserved compassion. I crawled back into bed, my hands shaking as I wrote in my notebook by the light of my phone. May 20th, glasses missing again for 3 hours. Found them in the basement on the workbench, a place I haven't been in months. Jessica says I must have carried them down and forgotten. But why would I go to the basement? And how did I get down those stairs without falling? May 22nd, Jessica taking pictures of everything I knock over. Heard her telling David I'm having episodes. She wants to put me in a facility. May 23rd, glasses missing all morning. Jessica found them in the refrigerator. Says I must have put them there by accident. But I don't remember opening the refrigerator yesterday at all. The pattern was becoming undeniable, but the evidence was so subtle, so easily explained away, that I felt insane even writing it down. Who would believe that someone was deliberately hiding an elderly woman's glasses? It sounded paranoid, delusional, exactly the kind of accusation that would confirm Jessica's narrative about my mental decline. But I knew. With the same certainty that had once helped me spot plagiarized papers and identify rare books, I knew Jessica was orchestrating my falls, creating evidence of incompetence, building a case for my removal from their home. The cruelest part wasn't the physical danger, though that was real enough. It was the way she'd comfort me afterward, her voice soft with false sympathy. "Oh, Margaret, you poor thing. Here, let me help you up. We really need to be more careful, don't we?" She'd dust me off, check for injuries with gentle hands, all while her eyes held that same cold calculation I'd seen in the bathroom. She was counting these incidents, cataloging them, using my genuine fear and confusion as weapons against me. At night, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, my glasses safely tucked under my pillow where I hoped she wouldn't think to look. The darkness felt safer than the blurred daylight world where furniture had sharp edges and floors had invisible obstacles. In the darkness, we were all equally blind. But even sleep offered no refuge. I dreamed of endless searches through rooms that kept changing, of reaching for glasses that crumbled to dust in my hands, of falling down stairs that stretched forever into blackness. I was losing more than my vision. I was losing my grip on reality, my confidence in my own perceptions, my trust in the basic human decency of the people who were supposed to care for me. And Jessica, I realized with growing horror, was counting on exactly that. My body was betraying me in ways I'd never imagined possible. The constant falls had left me with a collection of bruises that painted my arms and legs in shades of purple, yellow, and green. My left wrist, which I'd used to break a fall near the kitchen island, ached with a persistent throb that made simple tasks like opening jars or turning doorknobs an exercise in gritted teeth determination. But it was the fear that did the most damage, the way my muscles had learned to anticipate disaster, tensing at every shadow, every unexpected sound. I'd stopped walking normally. Instead, I shuffled through the house like a ghost, one hand trailing along walls, testing each step before committing my weight to it. The confident stride that had once carried me through library stacks and busy downtown streets was gone, replaced by the hesitant gait of someone who no longer trusted the ground beneath her feet. Sleep had become a stranger. I'd lie in bed for hours, my mind racing through endless loops of doubt and fear. Did I really put my glasses in the refrigerator? Was I losing my memory along with my vision? The questions would chase each other around my skull until 3 or 4 in the morning, when exhaustion would finally drag me into a fitful doze filled with dreams of falling, searching, and calling for help that never came. My appetite disappeared first gradually, then completely. Food tasted like cardboard, and my stomach seemed to have shrunk to the size of a walnut. Jessica noticed, of course, commenting with false concern about how frail I was becoming, how my clothes hung loose on my diminishing frame. "You really should try to eat more, Margaret," she'd say, setting down a plate of food that might as well have been sawdust for all the appeal it held. "You're wasting away. Wasting away." The phrase haunted me because it felt so accurate. I was disappearing, not just physically but in every way that mattered. The Margaret who had once debated literature with college professors, who had organized community fundraisers, who had raised a kind and thoughtful son, she was vanishing, leaving behind only this frightened, confused shell. The headache started in June, probably from the constant stress of trying to navigate without proper vision. They'd begin as a tight band around my temples and spread until my entire skull felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Light became my enemy, even the gentle morning sun streaming through my bedroom curtains felt like needles piercing my brain. My digestive system rebelled too, cramping and churning at the most inconvenient moments. I'd rush to the bathroom, my walker catching on doorframes in my haste, only to sit there in defeat as my body produced nothing but anxiety and gastric acid. Dr. Peterson would probably call it stress-related, but how could I explain the source of that stress without sounding paranoid? The worst part was what it was doing to my mind. The Margaret who had prized her sharp intellect, who had never forgotten a patron's name or misplaced an important document, was making mistakes that terrified her. I'd start to tell David something and lose my train of thought mid-sentence. I'd walk into a room and forget why I'd come there. I'd reach for words that had once come easily and find only empty spaces where they should have been. "Are you feeling all right, Mom?" David asked one evening after I'd called him by his father's name twice during dinner. I wanted to scream that no, I wasn't all right, that I was drowning in a sea of confusion and fear while his wife orchestrated my destruction piece by piece. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Just tired, dear. Old age, you know. Old age." As if what was happening to me was natural, inevitable, beyond anyone's control. Jessica seized on these moments with the efficiency of a prosecutor building a case. "She's been having more of these lapses lately," she'd tell David, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "Yesterday she couldn't remember our neighbor's name. And she's been talking to herself quite a bit." I wasn't talking to myself, I was trying to work through problems aloud, the same way I'd always done when faced with complex cataloging issues at the library. But in Jessica's narrative, it became evidence of mental decline, another symptom to add to her growing list of my incompetencies. The isolation compounded everything. I'd stopped calling my old friends because I was afraid of sounding confused or weak. I'd cancelled my subscription to the large-print mystery novels because reading had become too difficult, too exhausting. The television shows I'd once enjoyed seemed impossibly loud and chaotic, their bright colors and rapid movement overwhelming my compromised senses. I spent most days in my room now, curtains drawn against the painful light, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. My notebook had become my lifeline, the one place where I could record objective facts without Jessica's interpretation coloring them. June 5th, headache for third day straight. Fell again reaching for my water glass, couldn't see it clearly on the nightstand. Jessica says I need to accept my limitations. June 8th, David asked if I want to see a neurologist. Jessica suggested it might be the kindest thing. What does that mean? June 12th, woke up at 2 a.m. in tears. Don't remember what I was dreaming about, but the sadness feels like drowning. The handwriting was getting shakier, the words sometimes trailing off as fatigue overcame intention. Even this small act of rebellion was being stolen from me, my body's deterioration providing Jessica with exactly the evidence she needed to prove I was no longer capable of caring for myself. But in the deepest part of my soul, the part that Jessica hadn't yet managed to reach, a small flame still flickered. It whispered that what was happening to me wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable, wasn't my fault. That flame was all that kept me from surrendering completely to the darkness that Jessica was so carefully, methodically, wrapping around me. It was getting harder to tend that flame, but I wasn't ready to let it die. Not yet. The morning it happened, I should have known something was different. Jessica was humming while she made coffee, actually humming, something I hadn't heard her do in months. She even smiled at me when I shuffled into the kitchen, a bright, artificial expression that made my stomach clench with foreboding. "Good morning, Margaret," she chirped, her voice unnaturally cheerful. "I hope you slept well. David had to leave early for that site meeting, but he said to tell you he'd call this afternoon." I nodded, not trusting my voice. David's absence always made me nervous now, leaving me alone with Jessica and her unpredictable moods. But today felt different, charged with an energy that reminded me of the moments before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. My glasses sat on the kitchen counter where I'd left them the night before, a small victory in my ongoing battle for independence. I'd taken to keeping multiple pairs hidden throughout the house, though Jessica seemed to find them with unsettling regularity. This morning, though, they were exactly where I'd placed them, and I slipped them on with relief, the world snapping back into focus. "I'm going upstairs to organize the linen closet," Jessica announced, already moving toward the stairs. "Take your time with breakfast." Something in her tone made me look up sharply, but she was already disappearing around the corner, her footsteps light on the hardwood stairs. I ate my toast in silence, unease growing with each bite, though I couldn't name its source. It wasn't until I'd finished eating and went to clear my plate that I realized my glasses were gone. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. I'd been wearing them just moments before, I was certain of it. I could remember the feeling of them sliding into place, the relief of clear vision returning. But now my face felt naked, exposed, and the world had returned to its familiar, treacherous blur. I searched frantically, running my hands over every surface within reach. The counter, the table, the windowsill above the sink. Nothing. My breathing became shallow and rapid as the familiar terror of helplessness washed over me. "Jessica." I called, my voice cracking with desperation. "Jessica, I can't find my glasses." No answer. The house felt impossibly quiet, as if it were holding its breath along with me. I knew I needed to get upstairs to ask for help, but the staircase loomed before me like a mountain. Without my glasses, the steps blended together in a confusing pattern of light and shadow. I gripped the banister with white knuckles, testing each step with my toe before shifting my weight forward. Halfway up, I realized what Jessica had done. She hadn't just hidden my glasses this time. She'd waited until I was committed to climbing the stairs, until I was at my most vulnerable, suspended between floors with no safe way forward or back. The humming, the cheerful demeanor, David's convenient absence, it had all been orchestrated. I was trapped. My left foot, searching for the next step, found only empty air. For a terrifying moment I teetered on the edge, my arthritic fingers burning as they clutched the banister. Then gravity claimed me, and I was falling backward, my body twisting as I tried desperately to protect myself. The impact drove all the air from my lungs. I hit the stairs hard, my right wrist taking the worst of it as I instinctively threw my hands out to break my fall. The pain was immediate and nauseating, shooting up my arm like lightning. I rolled and tumbled down the remaining steps, each impact sending new waves of agony through my already battered body. I came to rest on the hardwood floor at the bottom of the stairs, gasping and disoriented. My wrist was bent at an unnatural angle, and I could taste blood where I'd bitten my tongue. But the physical pain paled compared to the crushing realization of what had just happened. This wasn't neglect or forgetfulness or even casual cruelty. This was attempted murder. Jessica's footsteps sounded on the stairs above me, unhurried and deliberate. When she came into view, her face was a mask of manufactured concern, but I caught something else there, a flicker of satisfaction quickly suppressed. "Oh my goodness, Margaret. What happened?" She knelt beside me, her hands gentle as they checked for injuries, her voice perfectly pitched between worry and bewilderment. "Did you fall? Why were you trying to go upstairs without your walker?" Through the haze of pain and shock, I marveled at her performance. She was already constructing the narrative, already laying the groundwork for the story she'd tell David when he returned. The careless elderly woman who'd ignored safety protocols, who'd attempted something beyond her capabilities and paid the price. "My glasses," I whispered, the words barely audible through my swollen lips. "You took my glasses." "Your glasses?" Jessica's brow furrowed in apparent confusion. "Oh sweetheart, they're right here on the coffee table. You must have left them there after breakfast. I was going to bring them to you, but then I heard the terrible noise." I turned my head, and there they were, sitting innocently on the table I'd passed on my way to the stairs. Of course they were there now. Of course Jessica had placed them in the most obvious location, where anyone would expect to find them. "I was wearing them," I said, my voice stronger now despite the pain. "I was wearing them when I finished eating." Jessica's expression didn't change, but something cold and calculating flickered in her eyes. "Oh Margaret, you're confused. The fall must have shaken you up. You haven't worn your glasses since yesterday, I remember specifically because I worried about you moving around without them." The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I almost believed her. Almost. But the small flame inside me, the one that had kept me sane through months of gaslighting and manipulation, flared brighter. I knew what I had experienced. I knew what she had done. And for the first time since moving into this house, I understood with perfect clarity that Jessica wasn't just trying to drive me away or make me feel unwelcome. She was trying to kill me. The only question now was whether I had the strength to fight back before she succeeded. The emergency room doctor confirmed what I already knew: my wrist was fractured, a clean break that would require 6 weeks in a cast. As the nurse wrapped my arm in stark white fiberglass, I listened to Jessica spin her tale of my carelessness to anyone who would listen. "She's been having these episodes," Jessica explained to the young resident, her voice heavy with the kind of weary concern that comes from months of dealing with a difficult situation. "Memory issues, confusion about where she's left things. We've been trying to help her maintain her independence, but..." She let the sentence hang there, weighted with implication. The doctor nodded sympathetically, making notes on his clipboard that would undoubtedly become part of my permanent medical record. Another piece of evidence in Jessica's carefully constructed case against my competency. But something had shifted inside me during those terrifying moments on the stairs. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my thinking for months was finally beginning to clear, burned away by the white-hot clarity of understanding what Jessica had tried to do to me. I was not losing my mind. I was being systematically destroyed by someone who wanted me gone. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant I was living with someone who wished me harm, perhaps even dead. Liberating because it meant I could stop questioning my own perceptions and start fighting back. My first act of rebellion was small but significant. While Jessica was filling out paperwork at the hospital reception desk, I asked the nurse for a moment alone with the doctor. "Doctor," I said quietly, "I need you to know that I was wearing my glasses when I fell. They weren't on the coffee table where my daughter-in-law claims I left them." He looked at me with the kind of patient tolerance reserved for confused elderly patients. "Mrs. Chen, head injuries can sometimes affect our memory of events. It's quite common for—" "I don't have a head injury," I interrupted, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "And my memory is fine." Someone moved my glasses while I was attempting to climb the stairs. The doctor's pen stopped moving. For a moment, he really looked at me, not at an elderly woman with a history of falls, but at a human being making a serious accusation. That's a very serious allegation, Mrs. Chen." "Yes," I said simply. "It is." He made a note in my chart, though I suspected it was probably about my paranoid ideation rather than my actual concerns. But I had planted a seed of doubt, created a record of my suspicions. It was a beginning. Over the next few days, confined to bed rest while my wrist healed, I began planning my resistance with the same methodical approach I'd once used to reorganize entire library collections. I couldn't confront Jessica directly, she was too skilled at manipulation, and David too convinced of her innocence. But I could start protecting myself. My first priority was my glasses. I began hoarding them like a squirrel preparing for winter, hiding pairs in places Jessica wouldn't think to look. One pair taped to the underside of my bedroom dresser drawer. Another wrapped in tissue and tucked inside a pillowcase in the linen closet. A third pair slipped between the pages of a large print Bible on my bookshelf. Jessica's secular sensibilities meant she'd never touch it. The hiding spots had to be accessible despite my caste and limited mobility, but invisible to someone conducting a casual search. I felt like a spy in my own home, and perhaps that's exactly what I was, gathering intelligence on an enemy who wore the face of family. My second priority was communication. For months, I'd been too ashamed to reach out to old friends, too afraid of sounding confused or needy. But lying in bed with my arm throbbing, I realized that isolation was exactly what Jessica wanted. She needed me cut off from outside perspectives, from people who might question her narrative about my declining capabilities. Rose Nakamura had been my closest friend at the library, a social worker who'd specialized in family services before retiring. We'd worked together on literacy programs, shared countless conversations about the complexities of human behavior, and maintained a friendship that had survived the usual drift that comes with retirement. If anyone would understand what I was experiencing, it would be Rose. My phone felt foreign in my left hand. I'd been right-handed my entire life, but I managed to find Rose's number in my contacts. My heart hammered as it rang, months of isolation making even this simple act feel monumental. "Margaret?" Rose's voice was warm with surprise and pleasure. "What a wonderful surprise. I was just thinking about you the other day." The kindness in her voice nearly undid me. Tears I'd been holding back for weeks threatened to spill over as I realized how hungry I'd been for simple human warmth. "Rose," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "I need help." There was a brief pause, and when Rose spoke again, her tone had shifted into the professional mode I remembered from our working days. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I told her everything. About the glasses, the falls, Jessica's accusations of attention-seeking, the deliberate isolation from family conversations. I told her about the stairs, about waking up to find my glasses moved to impossible locations, about the systematic documentation of my every stumble. Rose listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or concern. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret," she said finally, "what you're describing is elder abuse. Psychological abuse, physical endangerment, and quite possibly financial exploitation if she's positioning to have you declared incompetent. Elder abuse. The clinical term for what I'd been experiencing gave it weight, legitimacy. It wasn't just family tension or adjustment difficulties, it was a crime. But who would believe me? I asked. Jessica's so convincing, and I have been falling more, forgetting things. Because you're being deliberately traumatized, Rose said firmly. Margaret, you were one of the sharpest people I ever worked with. If you say someone is systematically tormenting you, I believe you. And more importantly, there are ways to document it, ways to protect yourself. For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, hope. Tell me what to do, I said. And Rose, bless her practical social worker's heart, began to teach me how to fight back. Rose arrived 3 days later with a manila folder thick with legal documents and a determination that reminded me why she'd been so effective in her social work career. She hugged me carefully, mindful of my cast, and I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying for months finally begin to ease. First things first, she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. We're going to document everything properly. Your notebook is a good start, but we need to be more systematic. She pulled out a legal pad and a small digital recorder I'd never seen before. This is voice-activated, she explained. Keep it with you always. Jessica won't know it's recording unless she sees the little red light, and it's small enough to hide in your pocket or under a pillow. The idea of secretly recording Jessica felt like crossing a line, but Rose's expression was serious. Margaret, what she's doing to you is criminal. If we're going to stop her, we need evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Over the next hour, Rose walked me through proper documentation techniques. Dates, times, witnesses present, exact quotes when possible. She showed me how to photograph the locations where my glasses appeared after being moved, how to take pictures of my bruises and injuries with timestamps. Don't just write, Jessica was mean, she instructed. Right at 2:15 p.m. on July 3rd, Jessica said, you're being dramatic about your pain, Margaret. Everyone your age has aches. David was present but reading his newspaper. The specificity felt empowering. After months of doubting my own memories, having a framework for preserving them gave me back a sense of control. Rose also brought printouts from elder abuse websites, highlighting sections about psychological manipulation and deliberate endangerment. This is what gaslighting looks like, she said, pointing to a paragraph that could have been written about my experiences. The victim begins to doubt their own perceptions because the abuser systematically contradicts their reality. Reading those words in black and white was like seeing my reflection after months of looking in funhouse mirrors. I wasn't losing my mind, I was being deliberately driven toward that conclusion. Now, Rose said, we need to rebuild your support network. Jessica has isolated you from everyone who might question her narrative. That ends today. She handed me a list of phone numbers, former colleagues from the library, neighbors from my old apartment building, members of the book club I'd belonged to for 15 years. People I'd been too ashamed to contact, too afraid of seeming pathetic or needy. Call them, Rose said firmly. Not to ask for help initially, just to reconnect. Let them remember who you really are, not the confused, helpless person Jessica wants them to see. The first call was to Eleanor Hartwell, who'd worked at the reference desk beside me for 20 years. Her voice lit up when she heard mine. Margaret Chen. Where have you been hiding? I've missed our coffee dates terribly. We talked for an hour, reminiscing about difficult patrons and beloved books, laughing about administrative follies we'd weathered together. When I mentioned I was staying with David while recovering from my hip surgery, Eleanor immediately picked up on my hesitation. And how is that going, dear? Living with family can be challenging at our age. Something in her tone told me she'd understand, so I took a small risk. It's been more difficult than I expected. My daughter-in-law and I seem to have different ideas about many things. Ah, Eleanor said knowingly. The daughter-in-law situation. I remember when my sister went through something similar. Some women see their husband's mother as competition rather than family. It was a gentle way of acknowledging conflict without requiring me to reveal details, and I felt a wave of gratitude for her diplomatic understanding. By the end of the week, I'd reconnected with 6 old friends and colleagues. None of these conversations involved detailed revelations about Jessica's abuse. Rose had counseled me to rebuild relationships first, establish credibility second. But each call reminded me of who I'd been before moving into this house, the respect I'd commanded, the capabilities I'd possessed. Margaret Chen, the librarian, had been competent, organized, and perceptive. Margaret Chen, the victim, might doubt her own memories, but Margaret Chen, the professional, knew how to research, how to build cases, how to present evidence. I also started documenting Jessica's behavior with new precision. When she found my glasses in the downstairs bathroom medicine cabinet, a location I couldn't reach without a step stool, I photographed them before and after, noting the time and that I'd been wearing them just an hour earlier while reading in my room. The recorder captured her voice as she said, "Really, Margaret, you need to pay more attention to where you put things. This forgetfulness is getting worse." I captured her taking photos of a water glass I'd accidentally knocked over while searching for my glasses, heard her muttering to herself about more evidence of instability. Most damning of all, I recorded her phone conversation with someone I didn't recognize, discussing the Margaret problem and how David is finally starting to see that she needs professional care. Rose reviewed my evidence weekly, helping me organize it chronologically and by type of abuse. We created a timeline that showed the escalating pattern of Jessica's behavior, from subtle comments to deliberate endangerment. "This is solid," Rose said after our 3rd meeting. "Any objective observer looking at this documentation would see clear evidence of systematic elder abuse." But we both knew the challenge wasn't just proving abuse, it was getting David to see past his wife's careful manipulation and his own denial about what was happening in his home. Some people, Rose warned me, refuse to believe abuse is occurring even when presented with overwhelming evidence. They've invested too much in the abuser to face the truth. I thought about David's gentle dismissals, his suggestions that I adjust my attitude, his apparent blindness to his wife's cruelty. My son loved me, I was certain of that. But love wasn't always enough to overcome willful blindness. What if he won't listen? I asked. Rose's expression was grim but determined. "Then we go to Adult Protective Services, and we make sure you have somewhere safe to go." "But Margaret, you have every right to demand that your own son protect you from his wife's abuse." For the first time since moving into David's house, I began to believe that escape might be possible. Rose and I spent 2 weeks preparing for what she called the conversation that will change everything. We met in my room while Jessica was at work, spreading my evidence across the bedspread like generals planning a campaign. "Remember," Rose said, reviewing my timeline for the 10th time, "David's first reaction will be disbelief, then denial, then anger, possibly at you for making these accusations. You need to stay calm, stick to facts, and be prepared for him to defend Jessica initially." I nodded, though my stomach churned with anxiety. The thought of confronting my own son with evidence of his wife's cruelty felt like preparing to perform surgery on myself. But Rose was right, David needed to hear this from me, in private, before Jessica could frame the conversation on her terms. "What if he doesn't believe me?" I asked for the 100th time. "Then you give him the ultimatum we discussed," Rose replied firmly. "You tell him that you'll be filing a report with Adult Protective Services and exploring alternative living arrangements. Sometimes people need to understand there are consequences before they're willing to face uncomfortable truths." We practiced the conversation over and over, with Rose playing David and throwing every possible objection at me. She was merciless in her role-playing, echoing every dismissive comment David had made over the past months. "But Mom, Jessica's been nothing but patient with you. I think you're misinterpreting her stress as hostility. Maybe you should consider that your perception might be affected by your medications." Each rehearsed response felt like a small knife wound, but Rose insisted I needed to be prepared for David's predictable defenses. By the end of our practice sessions, I could respond to his likely objections without dissolving into tears or self-doubt. "You're not asking him to choose between you and Jessica," Rose reminded me during our final preparation meeting. "You're asking him to choose between enabling abuse and protecting his mother. Frame it that way, as his moral obligation, not his emotional preference." Rose also helped me prepare practical alternatives, should David refuse to act. She'd researched several assisted living communities that specialized in residents with vision impairment, facilities where I could maintain my independence while having access to support services. The costs would strain my savings, but I had enough for several years if necessary. "Financial independence is crucial," Rose explained. "You need David to understand that you're not trapped here, that you have choices. People are more likely to address problems when they know the victim can leave." I also consulted with an elder law attorney Rose recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Valdez who specialized in abuse cases. She reviewed my documentation and confirmed that Jessica's behavior constituted criminal elder endangerment under state law. "The pattern is clear," Attorney Valdez said, tapping my photographs of bruises and the timeline of falls. "This isn't neglect or family tension, it's systematic abuse designed to cause harm. If you choose to press charges, you have a strong case." Knowing I had legal recourse gave me strength, even though I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I wanted David to protect me because he was my son and loved me, not because he feared legal consequences. The opportunity finally came on a rainy Thursday evening in late July. Jessica had texted David that she'd be working late with a difficult client, giving us several hours alone. I found David in his father's old study, reviewing engineering reports by lamplight, looking tired and older than his 42 years. "David," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, "I need to talk to you about something important." He looked up with the patient expression he'd worn for months whenever I needed his attention, loving but slightly resigned, as if preparing for another minor crisis or complaint. "Of course, Mom. What's on your mind?" I'd planned to ease into the conversation gradually, but seeing his kind face in the lamplight, I felt a surge of desperate love for this man who'd once been my baby, my greatest pride. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Jessica has been abusing me." David's pen stopped moving. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled only by the sound of rain against the windows and the ticking of his father's old clock. "Mom," he said finally, his voice careful and gentle, "that's a very serious accusation." "Yes," I said, pulling out my folder of evidence with trembling hands. "It is." I laid out the photographs first, pictures of my glasses in impossible locations, images of bruises and injuries, timestamps showing the pattern of Jessica's discoveries of items I'd supposedly misplaced. David examined each one silently, his expression unreadable. Then I played the recordings. Jessica's voice filled the study, cold and calculating as she discussed the Margaret problem and documented my falls. Her cruel dismissal of my pain, her systematic gaslighting, her casual references to my need for professional care. David listened to his wife's voice describing me as an attention-seeking burden, heard her orchestrating my isolation and documenting my struggles. With each recording, I watched something shift in his face, the patient skepticism giving way to recognition, then growing horror. When the last recording ended, we sat in silence. David stared at the photographs scattered across his desk as if they were evidence from a crime scene, which in many ways, they were. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would Jessica do this?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer was so simple and so painful. "Because she wants me gone, David. And she's been systematically trying to make that happen." My son, my brilliant, kind engineer's son, put his head in his hands and began to cry. Watching my son cry over evidence of his wife's cruelty was one of the most heartbreaking moments of my life. David sobbed like the little boy he'd once been when he'd scraped his knee or lost a beloved pet, and I fought every maternal instinct to comfort him instead of pressing for the justice I desperately needed. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered through his tears. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." The apology I'd been waiting months to hear should have felt triumphant, but instead it just felt sad. My son was a good man who'd been manipulated by someone far more skilled at deception than he was at detecting it. "David," I said gently, "I need to know what you're going to do about this." He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "I don't know. I mean, I have to confront her, obviously. But Mom, this is my wife. The woman I've been married to for 8 years. How do I even begin to process that she's been?" He gestured helplessly at the evidence spread across his desk. "Systematically abusing your mother," I finished for him. Rose had taught me not to soften the language, not to make it easier for people to avoid the reality of what had happened. David flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Yes. That." I pulled out the folder Rose had prepared for this moment, information about elder abuse, statistics about how common it was within families, resources for both victims and their relatives. "This isn't your fault, David. Abusers are skilled at hiding their behavior from people whose opinions matter to them. Jessica showed you one face and me another. But the signs," David said, picking up one of the photographs showing bruises on my arm. "I saw you falling, heard you having trouble finding things. I just accepted her explanations. Because you trusted your wife and wanted to believe the best of her," I said. "That's not a character flaw, David. But now you know the truth, and what matters is how you respond." He was quiet for a long time, studying the timeline Rose and I had created. I could almost see him processing the information, his engineer's mind working through the pattern of evidence. "The glasses," he said suddenly. "She was always finding them in strange places, always had an explanation for why you'd left them there. Places I couldn't reach, couldn't access, had no reason to visit," I confirmed. "She was setting up scenarios to make me fall, then documenting the results." David's face went white. "The stairs. When you broke your wrist. She said you'd left your glasses downstairs." "I was wearing them when I started up the stairs, David. She took them while I was climbing, leaving me blind and trapped halfway up." The horror in his eyes told me he finally understood the full scope of what Jessica had done. This wasn't just emotional cruelty or neglect, it was deliberate endangerment that could have killed me. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and I heard in his voice the same tone he'd used as a child when he'd broken something precious and wanted to make it right. I pulled out the ultimatum Rose and I had crafted together. "Jessica's behavior stops immediately. She attends counseling for abusive behavior and makes genuine amends for what she's done. She accepts oversight of any future interactions with me. If she refuses any of these conditions, I will file a report with Adult Protective Services and pursue criminal charges for elder abuse." David looked shocked. "Criminal charges? Mom, that seems... What would you call deliberately causing an elderly person to fall down the stairs?" I interrupted. "What would you call systematically terrorizing someone who depends on you for care?" He had no answer for that, which was answer enough. "And David," I continued, meeting his eyes directly, "if you're not willing to enforce these conditions, if you choose to protect Jessica instead of holding her accountable, then I'll be moving to an assisted living facility within the month." "Mom, no. This is your home now." "This is Jessica's home," I corrected. "It was never mine. But it could be, if she faces consequences for her actions and changes her behavior." David stood up and began pacing, his hands running through his hair the way they had when he was stressed about exams in college. "How do I even confront her with this? How do I tell my wife that I know she's been abusing my mother?" "Carefully," I said. "And with witnesses. Rose will be here, and I want everything recorded. Jessica is skilled at manipulation, David. She'll try to turn this around, make herself the victim, convince you that I'm lying or confused. You really think she'd do that? I gestured to the evidence on his desk. After everything you've just seen, do you really doubt what she's capable of? He sank back into his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I love her, Mom. Despite all this, I still love her. I know you do, sweetheart. And maybe there's a version of this where she gets help and becomes the woman you thought you married. But that can only happen if she faces real consequences and chooses to change. And if she doesn't? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. If Jessica refused to accept responsibility, refused counseling, refused to change, then David would have to choose between enabling his wife's abuse or protecting his mother. It was a choice no son should have to make, but Jessica had forced it on all of us. Then you'll know who she really is, I said quietly. And you'll have to decide if that's someone you can stay married to. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his father's old desk calendar as if it might contain answers to impossible questions. When he finally looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in months, the decisive, protective man who'd driven 3 hours to rescue me from the hospital. I'll call her, he said. Tell her we need to talk when she gets home. Will you ask Rose to come over? I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. After months of careful planning and evidence gathering, we were finally going to confront Jessica directly. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending, no more careful documentation of abuse. Just truth, consequences, and the hope that somewhere underneath her cruelty, the woman my son had fallen in love with was still capable of change. Jessica arrived home at 9:30, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor with the confident rhythm of someone who believed she still controlled every aspect of our household. I heard her call out cheerfully to David, asking about his day, completely unaware that everything had changed in her absence. Rose sat beside me on the living room couch, her digital recorder discreetly positioned on the coffee table. David had chosen the living room for this confrontation because, as he put it, neutral territory, not Jessica's domain like the kitchen, not his sanctuary like the study. Just the space where we'd once shared pleasant evening conversations, back when I still believed Jessica cared about me. David, you sounded so serious on the phone, Jessica said as she entered the room, stopping short when she saw Rose and me waiting with him. Her practiced smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. Oh, hello Rose. Margaret. What's this about? David stood behind his father's old chair, his hands gripping the back so tightly his knuckles were white. The evidence we'd reviewed was spread across the coffee table, photographs, transcripts, the timeline of abuse that painted an unmistakable picture of systematic cruelty. Jessica, David said, his voice steadier than I'd expected, we need to talk about how you've been treating my mother. Jessica's laugh was light, dismissive. Oh David, has she been complaining again? I know it's been difficult for everyone, adjusting to. I have recordings of you, David interrupted, and Jessica's laughter died as if someone had cut off her air supply. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Jessica's face cycle through expressions, confusion, denial, calculation, and finally, the cold fury I'd seen so many times when David wasn't around. Recordings of what? She asked, but her voice had lost its warmth. David pressed play on the device, and Jessica's voice filled the room. She always cries for attention. She's fine, she just wants sympathy. Can't you see what she's doing? Jessica's face went pale, then flushed red. That's taken out of context. She had fallen again, and I was frustrated because. There's more, David said, playing the recording of Jessica discussing the Margaret problem with her unknown confidant, talking about my need for professional care and how she was documenting my instability. With each recording, I watched Jessica realize that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. The mask she'd worn for 8 years of marriage was being stripped away, revealing the calculating woman underneath. How dare you, Jessica said, turning on me with venom I'd never seen even in her worst moments. How dare you spy on me in my own home? Record private conversations like some kind of. Like someone trying to document abuse. Rose interjected calmly. Because that's exactly what Margaret was doing. Protecting herself from further harm. Jessica whirled on Rose. Who are you to interfere in our family business? I'm a retired social worker who specializes in elder abuse, Rose replied evenly. And what you've done to Margaret constitutes criminal behavior under state law. For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica looked genuinely frightened. The confident, manipulative woman who'd spent months terrorizing me was finally facing consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. David, she said, turning back to her husband with desperate eyes, you can't believe this nonsense. Your mother is confused, probably early dementia, and she's being manipulated by this woman who doesn't even know our situation. I held my breath, waiting to see if David would waver, if Jessica's manipulation would work one more time. I've seen the evidence, Jessica, David said quietly. The photographs, the timeline, the recordings. I know what you did. What I did. Jessica's voice rose to a near shriek. What I did was take care of your needy, demanding mother for months while you were oblivious to how difficult she was making our lives. By hiding her glasses so she'd fall down the stairs. David's voice was getting stronger, more certain. By terrorizing her until she was afraid to leave her room. By systematically trying to convince everyone she was incompetent. Jessica stared at him, and I saw the moment she realized that denial was no longer an option. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was flat, emotionless. She was ruining our marriage. Every conversation was about Margaret's needs, Margaret's problems, Margaret's latest crisis. We couldn't make plans, couldn't have privacy, couldn't live our own lives because everything revolved around taking care of poor, helpless Margaret. The honesty was brutal, but also liberating. Finally, Jessica was admitting her true feelings instead of hiding behind false concern. So you decided to abuse her? David asked incredulously. I decided to document the reality of living with her so you could see that we needed other arrangements, Jessica shot back. If that meant she had a few more accidents along the way, well, maybe that would speed up the process. The casual admission of deliberate endangerment hung in the air like poison. Even Jessica seemed to realize she'd gone too far, her hand flying to cover her mouth as if she could take the words back. Jesus, Jessica, David whispered. You could have killed her. But I didn't, Jessica said desperately. She's fine. She's dramatic and attention-seeking, but she's fine. Rose stood up, her voice carrying the authority of decades in social services. Jessica, you're going to have some choices to make. You can acknowledge what you've done, seek counseling for abusive behavior, and make genuine amends to Margaret. Or you can continue denying and minimizing, in which case Margaret will be filing criminal charges and a report with Adult Protective Services. You can't prove anything, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. We can prove everything, I said, speaking for the first time since she'd entered the room. And we will, if necessary. Jessica looked around the room, at her husband's disappointed face, at Rose's professional determination, at my own newfound strength, and seemed to finally understand that her reign of terror was over. I want to speak to David alone, she said finally. No, David replied firmly. Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of witnesses. I won't be manipulated anymore, Jessica. And in that moment, I knew my son had finally chosen to protect his mother over protecting his wife's secrets. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment at Willowbrook Senior Living, arranging books on shelves that were exactly the right height for someone with my limitations. Sunlight streamed through windows I could open myself, illuminating a space that was entirely mine, no hidden corners where someone might lurk with cruel intentions, no surfaces where my glasses might mysteriously disappear. The community library where I volunteered 3 mornings a week was buzzing with activity when I arrived that Tuesday morning. Mrs. Patterson was struggling with the computer catalog again, and Mr. Rodriguez needed help finding large print biographies. These were the kinds of problems I enjoyed solving, genuine needs from people who appreciated my expertise rather than resented my very existence. Margaret, dear, called Dorothy Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, my neighbor and closest friend at Willowbrook. How did the meeting with David go yesterday? I smiled, settling into my volunteer chair. Better than I hoped. It was true. David's visits had evolved from the awkward, guilt-ridden encounters of those first months into something that felt genuinely healing for both of us. Yesterday, he'd brought photo albums from my old apartment, pictures I'd thought were lost forever when I'd moved in with them so hastily after my fall. We'd spent 2 hours looking through images of his father and me in our younger days, of David's childhood birthday parties and school plays, of family vacations where we all looked impossibly happy and carefree. For the first time in over a year, we talked about pleasant memories without the shadow of Jessica's cruelty hanging over us. I keep thinking I should have known, David had said, studying a photo of the three of us at his college graduation. All those years we were together, and I never saw what she was capable of. She didn't want you to see it, I'd replied, something I'd learned in my own therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez. Abusers are experts at compartmentalizing their behavior. The Jessica who was cruel to me wasn't the Jessica you married, but they were both real parts of the same person. David had nodded, though I could see he was still struggling to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the woman who'd terrorized his mother. His own counseling was helping, Dr. Martinez had assured me, but healing from betrayal takes time. Jessica had lasted exactly 3 weeks in the anger management program the court had mandated. She'd attended sessions, gone through the motions of making amends, and even written me a letter acknowledging her mistakes. But when David tried to discuss supervised visits or ongoing oversight of her behavior, she'd exploded in fury. "I'm not going to live like a criminal in my own home," she'd shouted during what turned out to be their final conversation. "If you choose that manipulative old woman over your own wife, then you're not the man I married." The divorce had been swift and brutal. Jessica had tried to claim emotional distress and demand alimony, but the evidence of her abuse made that impossible. She'd moved back to her mother's house in Phoenix, and according to David, had already begun telling people that she'd been the victim of an unstable mother-in-law and an unsupportive husband. I felt sorry for whoever she'd manipulate next. My own healing had surprised me with its complexity. The physical symptoms, the headaches, digestive issues, and chronic anxiety, had largely resolved once I was living safely. But the psychological recovery was more complicated, requiring me to rebuild my trust in my own perceptions and reclaim the confidence Jessica had systematically destroyed. Dr. Martinez had helped me understand that my hypervigilance wasn't paranoia, it was a reasonable response to months of deliberate psychological warfare. Learning to distinguish between genuine threats and trauma responses was an ongoing process, but I was getting stronger every week. The other residents at Willowbrook had embraced me from my first day. Many had their own stories of difficult family situations, and there was something healing about being surrounded by people who understood the particular challenges of aging in a youth-obsessed world. We looked out for each other without judgment, offered help without condescension, and created the kind of supportive community I'd always imagined but never experienced. My friendship with Rose had deepened beyond our initial advocate-victim relationship into something precious and sustaining. She visited every weekend, and we'd often spend hours discussing books, current events, and the satisfaction of seeing justice served. She'd been instrumental in helping me file the Adult Protective Services report that would protect other elderly people from Jessica's potential future employment in caregiving roles. "You know," Dorothy said, interrupting my reverie, "you look like a completely different person from the woman who moved in here 6 months ago." I glanced at my reflection in the library's window, clearer now thanks to new prescription glasses I'd chosen myself, and saw what she meant. The frightened, diminished woman who'd shuffled through David's house in constant fear had been replaced by someone who stood straight, spoke clearly, and met the world with confident curiosity. "I feel like a different person," I admitted. "Or maybe I feel like myself again." That afternoon, I had lunch with Eleanor from the old library, who'd become a regular visitor and cherished friend. We laughed about patron stories and shared book recommendations, the easy companionship of two women who'd found meaning in serving others. "You've been through hell and back," Eleanor said as we finished our coffee. "But you've come out stronger." "I've come out wiser," I corrected. "And I've learned that age doesn't make us automatically vulnerable to abuse, but isolation does. Community is everything." As evening approached, I settled into my favorite chair with a new mystery novel, my glasses securely perched on my nose and within easy reach should I need to set them down. Through my window, I could see other residents in their own apartments, living their own independent lives, surrounded by people who respected their dignity and valued their contributions. I thought about the Margaret who'd been so grateful to have family take care of her, who'd been willing to accept cruelty as the price of not being alone. She'd been a woman who'd forgotten her own worth, who'd traded her self-respect for the illusion of security. This Margaret, the one who'd fought back, demanded justice, and built a life of genuine safety and respect, knew better. She knew that being alone wasn't the worst thing that could happen to someone. Being trapped with people who wished you harm was infinitely worse. And she'd never, ever let anyone make her forget that again.